Thank you for coming to see me, and welcome to Gatekeeping and the DevOps Revolution. It is my first time speaking here, and I'm super excited to talk to you all. But after I'm done, I hope that you keep thinking about what I'm going to say. I want you to remember what it's like to be entirely new to tech. Think about how you feel every time you pick up something new and how every new thing feels just a little bit different. Really, really look at that. It can be hard to do, but I want you to look at it and use the result to make things better for the people who come after us. So my name is Kat Cosgrove, and that is Espresso, the cat that was introduced earlier, and I'm a developer advocate at JFrog. But I am not here to talk to you about any of our tools. Before I was a developer advocate, I spent a year at JFrog on the IoT team as a software engineer. I was fresh out of a coding bootcamp at the time and had been thrust into a very fast-paced environment. I needed to learn a whole bunch of new tools and technologies and workflows that I had just not been exposed to before. I had spent a while freelancing as a web developer, but this was nothing like building WordPress or Joomla sites for small businesses. Anyway, before I go any further, if you would like to get a hold of me later, that is easy to do. You can find me on Twitter at Dixie3Flatline, and I will also take some questions at the end. But if you miss me or come up with a question later on, just reach out. I'm super, super easy. So on the IoT team, we were building a proof of concept that demonstrated fast over-the-air updates for cars rather than the manual updates in a service center that most cars use now. I know some of you are probably thinking, my Tesla can do that, blah, blah, blah. And yes, it can. But it is very, very, very much the exception. There are a couple more cars that can do this now that couldn't do it then, but it's still not the norm. Most cars have multiple computers in them, and they have to be updated like via physical access. They have to be flashed. So this was cool. It solved a very real technical problem, but I was also way out of my depth at first. In just a couple of months, I had to learn about the difficulties of embedded Linux development and a little bit of electrical engineering, but I also had to learn all of these technologies on this slide. And I would never have been able to do that if I didn't have a manager who actually believed in me and a tech lead who functioned as a really outstanding mentor. So shout out to Brennan. I know you're not watching this, but maybe you'll hear about it. None of this was easy to learn. Not because I don't have a degree in computer science, which is true, I don't, or because I'm not smart enough, because I am smart, or because these things are just always difficult no matter who you are. It's the way we talk about and teach these things. I'll go into that in detail a little bit later. So let's make sure everyone's on the same page. I know this is a DevOps conference, and I know I can probably assume that you all know what that means, but to err on the side of safety and not be a hypocrite, this is the definition of DevOps I'll be running with during this talk. DevOps is the term for the union of the development team and the IT operations team through the use of a specific set of practices and tool chains with the ultimate goal of shortening the software development lifecycle and delivering more high-quality software. I promise I have a point. So in order for DevOps to work, you need both tools and a culture shift. This is an established fact, but it's still the topic of a lot of conference talks about DevOps while more companies move away from older methodologies and over to ours. I'm not going to go into this a ton because much more qualified people than me give outstanding talks on this very subject, and you should absolutely go listen to them instead. But to give context within the scope of this specific talk, for developers, DevOps may mean changing the way you write software. Your code needs to be written in a way that's more modular, so it's easier for other people to maintain. You should be merging with your source repository and pulling from main often, sometimes multiple times a day, and making much smaller changes each time. Build and unit tests have to run with every single commit, and that process needs to be automated. If the entire team does this, conflicts happen less often, and failures are discovered way earlier, allowing you to hopefully fix them immediately. So developers no longer exist in a silo. everyone has to do DevOps to some degree. The cultural shift can take some getting used to, but you're much more efficient and much less stressed out because a lot of the things you were doing manually before are being automated by your tools. The point I'm trying to make here is that an understanding of DevOps practices and tooling is not the exclusive domain of people with the word DevOps in their title. It's everyone who touches either side of this equation, or else it doesn't work. It's not just DevOps engineers or SREs or release managers. It's not just whoever is dealing with your infra. And a lot of this is actually pretty new in the grand scheme of things. The first commercially successful serverless platform was AWS Lambda in 2014. And now there's more of them than you can shake a stick at, plus some serverless databases just for fun. Just 4 years ago, Linkerd and the concept of a service mesh didn't exist, but in 2021, it's hard for some people to imagine a world without them. Some pieces of DevOps have been around since the early 90s, but they've changed so radically that they're nearly unrecognizable at this point. Our industry and our technology is rapidly evolving with layers and layers of abstraction between us and our code, and more teams across an organization are expected to have some level of familiarity with these things. So you, the expert, maybe with years of experience in the field and a title with the word DevOps in it, remember the birth of these tools, and you probably remember the birth of the concepts that led to these tools. You have the context and adjacent domain-specific knowledge to make picking up a new tool like these easier because you understand the why behind it. You've done without them, and you personally experienced the very specific ways in which things were harder then. So a high-level definition of something like a service mesh is enough for you. It's immediately clear how this tool could make your life easier. New grads and junior developers don't have that context though, and there are a lot of them, and we need them. Here's some numbers to convince you. So in the US, about 65,000 people graduate from a degree program in computer science each year, and that's rising. When you add in coding bootcamp grads like me, and you get about another 23,000, rising much more rapidly than a traditional degree program year over year. That's almost 90,000 new junior developers in the US alone each year. It is a lot of new talent and a lot of new ideas, which we all want. According to data from CompTIA, last year in the US, there were 307,000 new tech jobs. 123,000 of them were in Washington State, which is where I live. Now, that does include a variety of roles and seniority levels, but it's still an absolutely wild number. I don't know what these new grads are good at or what they like, but we mostly agree that DevOps is a full spectrum, all or nothing thing if it's going to work to its highest potential. Your junior devs are going to touch some of this stuff at some point, and it's better for all of us if they actually understand it. But we aren't exactly making that easy. Whether we realize it or not, the way we're doing things now is gatekeeping. It's unintentional and it's not malicious, but it is gatekeeping. So let's talk about that. Gatekeeping is the act of preventing access to something like a career, a community, or a fandom unless specific and usually unreasonable requirements are first met. For example, consider a woman going to the card store to play Magic the Gathering on a Friday night. Think of me in this context if you want. If you don't know what Magic the Gathering is, it's a competitive trading card game popular since the 90s, generally dominated by men. Instead of just letting me hang out and play, somebody might ask me to name the winning deck from every Magic the Gathering World Championship since 1994. That's an absurd requirement, so it's gatekeeping. It's malicious and intentional, though. I submit that there is a second type of gatekeeping. So if intentional gatekeeping is when we make an actual decision to take a real action with the express intent of forcing newbies to prove themselves in one way or another before being able to participate without applying that standard consistently, you're doing intentional gatekeeping, right? You're keep going out of your way to keep a particular set of people out or raise the bar for entry. Passive gatekeeping accomplishes the same thing. We keep someone out of a community or make it much harder for them to get in by requiring them to meet some bizarre standard. But instead of making an active choice, this happens unintentionally, maybe naturally, whether it's out of laziness or bad culture, a habit, or ignorance. In my opinion, there are 4 ways that we are passively preventing junior engineers from finding their place in DevOps: jargon, documentation, lack of mentoring, and weird hiring practices. I'll start with my personal pet peeve, which is jargon and the persistent assumption that everyone reading our content has been around since the dawn of DevOps with like a super deep understanding of all of its history and lore and arcane tooling. To illustrate this, I will present you with 2 pieces of jargon from things that the majority of you are not experts with. Coffee. It's very early here. So, fencing is an Olympic sport with 3 different styles, all of them with different rules: foil, epee, and saber. They also have different weapons and different equipment, but people do mix them up. It's an actual sport, not a martial art, and it's been around for a long time now. You may have watched it at the Olympics. Regardless of which weapon you fence, the definition of attack is always the same, and people who do not fence are almost never able to define it correctly. So take a moment to yourself and guess. Imagine, think of what you think an attack means in fencing. If you're not a fencer, there's probably at least one in the crowd. So you might think that an attack is any action intended to score a touch or a point against your opponent. That's actually not right. The attack is the initial offensive action made by extending the arm and continuously threatening the opponent's target, preceding the launching of the lunge or flesh. On the surface, that kind of makes sense, even if you don't know anything about fencing. The words go together. You understand that it's the first offensive action a fencer takes if they're sticking their arm out and aggressively threatening the opponent without doing any hedging or making any defensive movements before finally, what? You can guess at what a lunge is. Most people probably know, but what does flesh mean? Here we have jargon in the definition of our jargon. And in this case, it's not actually a huge problem. Fencers do know what a flesh is, and this sport is really old. All of the domain-specific terminology is established, and it has been for a long time. This is one Google search. It's not a big deal. Fencing gets away with this because in a lot of cases, the language used to talk about the sport hasn't changed in a century. DevOps technologies change year over year. We have technologies to provide abstractions for technologies that are abstractions for more technologies that didn't exist 10 years ago. We can't do that and expect newbies to understand quickly, just like I can't expect you to understand the next example. Goats. Does anyone know what that means in the context of video games? This is virtual, so I can't make eye contact with the crowd, but I'm going to pretend that a couple of you do know what I am referring to and have indicated that with a smirk and a nod. Acknowledged. I want to talk to the people who don't. So Overwatch is a first-person shooter by Blizzard with a robust competitive professional scene. In Overwatch, the term GOATs refers to a specific composition of heroes playable in the game, originally consisting of 3 tanks, heroes with lots of health who may move slowly and don't do a ton of damage, and 3 healers with no dedicated damage-dealing characters. The origin of this specific piece of jargon is kind of weird, though. You might guess that it stands for greatest of all time, a fairly common turn of phrase in English used to describe an athlete who is particularly talented. However, it actually refers to the name of a team by the same name who first popularized that particular composition and made a run through the bracket of Overwatch contenders, Blizzard's semi-professional league. It was unstoppable at the time. And so the composition was named after the team. Now, this is not user-friendly. This has layers. Unlike the example from fencing, goats gives you zero indication of what it could possibly mean. So when Blizzard wanted to expand viewership of Overwatch League to a more casual audience through streaming partnerships with ESPN and Disney, they had to do away with the term goats. Shoutcasters for matches were instructed to call the composition 3-3 instead, because it means what it says: 3 tanks and 3 healers, rather than needing a whole bunch of lore about semi-professional Overwatch competitions from 4 years ago to know what it means when somebody says, hey, let's go goats. Now, mainstream esports is in its infancy. It feels like we get a new piece of slang or jargon like once a month, but it's easy for me to pick it up because I've been watching esports for a long time and I have the context. That's not true for new folks trying to get into watching it casually. The term was a barrier for entry that didn't need to be there, so they got rid of it. The same goes for DevOps. Like Blizzard in the Overwatch League, if we want people to use our tools and do our stuff or move towards a more DevOps way of doing things at their companies, we have to make it involve fewer hurdles. Just using more descriptive words or going out of our way a little to clarify or define the domain-specific words we use goes a long way towards making our things more approachable. An experienced engineer moving over from a completely unrelated field to yours or trying your tool for the first time should still be considered a newbie. If we all put in just a tiny bit more work to define the jargon when we use it and do away with things that don't make sense on the surface, we make our products and our ways of doing things far more easily adoptable, which makes all of our jobs easier, especially if you've got to justify your salary to someone else. And I think most of us do. This is especially true when it comes to your technical documentation. Have a quick start guide, please. That quick start guide should be written as if directed at someone with zero understanding of your tool, because that's who's using it. That means that you need to give your reader the why for each thing. Don't just tell me that your product facilitates service-to-service communications between microservices using a sidecar proxy. I don't know what that means. I do, but your reader doesn't. Tell me why that's useful in practical terms. What problem specifically are you solving? Linkerd is actually particularly good at this. Their docs include links out to explanations of relevant concepts and terms. There is a step-by-step guide, and every single command you run is explained in painstaking detail. Aside, pay your technical writers more. They are a powerful resource, and they deserve to be compensated for it. They're the ones writing this. Make it worth it for them. My only complaint with Linkerd's docs is the use of the word easy in a technical context, and here's why. Easy can be a very alienating term. If you use that word in technical documentation, marketing copy is another story, you need to be damn sure that it is really actually easy, not just easy for you. And it almost certainly isn't. If this new talent we want to be using our stuff doesn't find it easy when your docs repeatedly say it is, they're going to be discouraged. And I don't need to be struggling with imposter syndrome more than I already do. The reality is that none of this is actually easy until you're an expert, at which point we tend to forget that it isn't easy. And that's human nature, but we need to be aware of it. Call something easy when it's not for an absolute beginner, and you're gatekeeping again. They're going to be discouraged. You might say, but Kat, it was hard for me. It's normal for these things to be difficult to learn. That's just the way it is. I've heard that before. I've heard it several times before. Why? So what if it was hard when you did it? Why does it have to stay that way? Why is struggling to learn all of this 40 tabs open so you can Google every third word in a tutorial that was supposed to be for beginners, only to get 7 steps deep and find out that you also need to have a functional understanding of 2 different obscure AWS services to follow the rest of the now not so quick start guide considered normal and acceptable. That sucks. It's not fun. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources, and we can fix that. Until DevOps trade schools and boot camps become a thing, or universities start teaching these technologies too, we have to take teaching this stuff into our own hands. Remember, those 90,000 new grads a year, they need our help so we can take advantage of their energy and their insight. Juniors still have good ideas. Some people already have. There are a few great books out there now, some people doing workshops, and a ton of content creators writing on sites like dev.to for products they don't even own. I do this a lot just because I remembered how frustrating it was to learn this stuff myself. But we can't solve this problem without help, and we need a lot of it. And that has to come from each of your companies, your organizations, and your teams. If you have the energy for it, consider mentoring somebody in your spare time. Make yourself available to answer questions and make it clear that none of those questions are stupid. It's ubiquitous to us, but not everyone knows what the hell Ansible is. Proactively teach them the way you wish you had been taught, not the way you actually learned. Make it a junior on another team at your company, a new grad from the local college or boot camp, some random person from Twitter, whatever. Just help out. And I'm specifically talking to you here, seniors and team leads. If you let your junior teammates struggle longer than necessary, not only are you being a crappy teammate, you are actively detrimental to your organization. You're not doing your job. You are wasting time, and DevOps is about reducing time wasted. As a senior, one of your responsibilities is to mentor junior teammates. It is your literal job. Allowing things to continue as they are is not doing your job. Suffering isn't a rite of passage to DevOps excellence. We can do it without the suffering. Hiring managers. This is on you too, actually. You are not going to get a junior DevOps engineer with 5 years of experience in Kubernetes, Istio, Artifactory, Golang, Helm, Jenkins, Prometheus, Core DNS, Perl, network administration, and Azure, all of it, no specific service listed. First of all, that is a senior engineer, at least, probably more. Second of all, mastery in all of those things in one person is a ridiculous requirement. And you might think I'm exaggerating here. I am, but only a little. I combed through a bunch of job postings writing this talk, and some of the job requirements were absolutely wild for a junior title. This is a screenshot of an actual job listing with a title of Junior DevOps Engineer. I don't expect you to actually read this. You can just look at it and see that it's absurd. This was in the first page of results on Indeed for the Seattle area. I did not have to look hard to find an example for this slide at all, which is unpleasant. Reading all of these, I wonder if anyone actually knows what it means to be a junior. I would not qualify for this. Lots of people you look up to would not qualify for this. And we know it's absurd, but remember, we have context. Imagine how it looks to an actual junior. They don't know this is unreasonable. And this is just the skills section. The requirements section is equally ridiculous. It's awful and it's discouraging, and you are pushing away good people with a drive to learn who could be an asset to your organization because your expectations are unrealistic. Inexperienced people are going to look at this and think, wow, I'm not even qualified for a junior position in this industry, so why bother? You can advise people to just apply for everything all you want, but we all know that a piece of software is filtering out a ton of these resumes before they even hit a real person's desk. This is gatekeeping, whether it was an intentional attempt to underpay someone with more experience or it was passive gatekeeping as a result of ignorance. Consider instead that the landscape for DevOps and cloud native is so outrageously large at this point that unless your job requirements are very narrow anyone you hire is going to have to learn some new tooling. I know you can't really see what's going on this slide, but that actually helps me illustrate my point. This is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's landscape as of 2020. Instead of trying to hire juniors who already know everything there is to do the job on day one, because that's not a junior, juniors have to learn everything, focus first on hiring seniors and tech leads who have the core skills and technologies you want, as well as the ability to be mentors. Get them onboarded really well, and then hire juniors based on how well they learn, not what they know out of the box. Because reminder, nobody gets a degree in DevOps. We're all learning as we go here, including you, especially you. We're experts. We're more likely to try the new things first. Learning is our job too. Each of the things I've talked about here, rampant use of jargon, documentation written like the user's already an expert, a lack of mentorship, and unrealistic hiring expectations, is preventing us from getting access to the 90,000 exceptional new talents available to us each year in the US alone, and from making the best of the people we do have. Individually, these things are barriers, but together they are catastrophic. This is a cultural problem within DevOps that absolutely needs to be addressed if we want to live up to our goals of delivering better software faster. We cannot claim to be a culture of collaboration, caring, and cooperation if we're excluding anyone or forcing them to jump through hoops to participate. DevOps exists so that we don't have to suffer through the same problems with writing and delivering software that we did before. Every new tool or technique or strategy exists to solve a pain point. So why are we allowing these problems with our culture to continue? We're solving the problems for software, but we're ignoring the problems with people. As long as gatekeeping like this exists, we can't angrily reply, DevOps is a culture, not just a tool set, when someone thinks CI/CD means DevOps without being hypocrites. And I know we all love yelling at people about how DevOps is a culture, not a tool set. So here is what I'm asking from each of you today. Try to remember what it was like for you when you were new yourself. It might be difficult to do. Humans are really, really good at forgetting these things. But think about what you struggled with, the feelings you had, how long it took you to feel like an expert in anything at all, the people around you and how they treated you. Then use that to change the way you speak, the way you write, the way you work, and the way you hire for the better, so that nobody has to struggle like we did. Thank you for coming to my session. I would also like to thank the organizers for having me and all of the sponsors that helped this event happen. I will be around answering questions for a bit, but again, you can always get a hold of me on Twitter at Dixie3Flatline. Good evening, good afternoon. I'm not sure what time it is. It's very early for me though.
Thank you, Kat. Absolutely fantastic, and the chat is actually, it's going absolutely crazy. All the praise for the extremely good talk, and I think that all the people who are listening to this are pretty much agreeing what you said, and I really like the part that I can find myself as well from time to time to be in at least a passive gatekeeper in certain places, and it really takes the kind of work and the self-discipline to get kind of out of that box and make those things happen that you mentioned. So maybe a couple of questions if I can. The chat it's going absolutely crazy. I can even find a question from here. So give me a second.
Sure.
Let me see if there is some. There's so many, kudos to you.
It's a lot of hell yeah.
Yeah.
in the chat. Yeah. A question that arises in my head is, could this be a problem that is more or less frequent all over the world or in different cultures? I mean, we are so global now. Could this be more or less a problem depending on where on the globe we live?
Well, some aspects of it might be less of a problem in some places, but we're all generally reading the same technical documentation. So the issues with the way documentation is written and the use of jargon is probably pretty consistent, at least as long as you're reading English language documentation. I can kind of read French, but not enough to read technical documentation. So I can only speak for English language docs there, but we're all reading the same docs. So those problems are consistent regardless of where you're from or what your culture is. The mentorship issue I can see being less of a problem in some places, but regrettably, I don't have research to answer that question affirmatively in either direction.
All right, I have one question from Espen Madsen 9 minutes ago. So any ideas on how to address the company culture of using a ton of code names for different aspects of the same overall project?
Yeah, that kind of requires people who are like in a position of power, people who have authority, speaking up about it. And like, to some extent, I think code names are okay, but you have to define them at some point, you know? I don't think everything needs to be named like explicitly, but if you aren't naming things explicitly, you have to provide a definition at some point. And if there's a problem in your organization where everybody's using a lot of like shorthand and code names and abbreviations for things, but they aren't actually documented anywhere, that's something for like a team lead, a manager to speak up about, or maybe a team lead or a manager just, writes the documentation themselves, a glossary of or something, and then hands it over to leadership and says, "Hey, we need to be doing this," because it is irritating. It bothers me a lot, especially when I moved over to as a developer advocate, I'm in the marketing org instead of in engineering. And there's a lot of like marketing slang that I don't know what that is. Like, I didn't know what an OKR was. And it gets a little bit overwhelming. But yeah, that is a thing to get a manager to address.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you a lot, Kat. This was really good. And
one more question, Ragnar. There's one more question.
One more question. I thought we're going to give the next speech.
Yeah, because this is actually very, very good and spot on. So from Staffan Johansson from 3 minutes ago. So if you exchange junior developer to female developer, do you see the same tendencies of gatekeeping in the business, and can managers apply the same strategies?
Yeah, so all of these problems still exist. At least I've experienced them personally. Women tend to, we tend to be more susceptible to imposter syndrome. So we're also like, we're less likely to speak up about these things. I would have had considerably more trouble as an engineer at JFrog if I didn't have a tech lead who was like very bullish about my success. And if he saw me doing something that looked imposter syndrome-y, he would nip it in the bud like very, very quickly. So yeah, I do think this is all also a problem with female developers, but women are we're more susceptible to parts of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kat, once again. Job well done. Very good presentation.
Thank you very much.